Hey my friends, thanks for coming back with your girl Anna B behind the walls. Friends, you read correctly. This time we're going to take a look at some men serving life in the state of Mississippi. Betty Lewis Vaughns was known as Miss Betty to those who knew her. She was a registered nurse and the owner of Providence Home Care Services. She made a mark on the community of Moss Point's River City and earned the respect of others because of her kind heart and willingness to go the extra mile to help those who couldn't help themselves. No one who knew Miss Betty could even begin to imagine who would want to harm her. Miss Betty was married. She had 3 children, a son, 2 biological daughters, and a foster daughter she treated as her own. Miss Betty assisted her foster daughter, her husband, and her children financially. The family even lived in Miss Betty's personal care home that was next door to her house before she helped them get their own apartment. Miss Betty's foster daughter suspected her husband, Octavius Black, of cheating, so she locked him out of their apartment this night. In response, he walked over to Miss Betty's house, a place where he had always found support. He asked Miss Betty if he could stay the night, but she declined because she had a new client. Instead of finding another solution, he choked Miss Betty until she lost consciousness. He went inside her house, retrieved the keys to her 2003 beige Cadillac Escalade, and as he was driving away, Octavius Black ran Miss Betty over, leaving her there alone to die. Miss Betty's body was found by her foster daughter lying in the driveway of her home on Bellevue Avenue. Octavius turned himself and Miss Betty's Cadillac into the Prentice Police Department. That's where he had driven to the night he took Miss Betty's life. He was interviewed. He initially denied knowing what happened to Miss Betty, but he later confessed that he took her vehicle by force and told officers that he felt a bump as he was leaving her home. He further confessed that after taking Miss Betty's vehicle without her permission, he took money that he had found in her center console and threw her cell phone out somewhere along the interstate. Once he discovered the police were looking for Miss Betty's vehicle, he removed her personalized tag. He was arrested and later indicted on capital murder charges. After a 3-day trial, a Jackson County jury found Octavius Montego Black guilty of capital murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. My condolences to the Vaughns family, Miss Betty's patience, and the community that she made an impact on. May she rest in peace. Glenn Conley has claimed his innocence for the entire 20-plus years of his incarceration. He states he has been wrongfully convicted along with dozens of other men in the Mississippi Department of Corrections. From Louisiana, Glenn graduated high school in 1987, and he immediately joined the U.S. Army for 3 years. Glenn believed he had fathered a child following a one-night encounter with a woman named Taronda he went to school with. They ran into one another one night after Glenn had returned from the Army. He found out about the little girl named Whitney from a mutual acquaintance. He set out to meet her, which he did. He claims to have started spending time with the little girl, picking her up on occasions, as well as giving her mother money. Glenn's nightmare began August 20th, 1997, 4 days after he graduated from San Jacinto Community College with a nursing degree. Shortly after Glenn's arrival to work at Supreme Healthcare in Houston, Texas, 2 men approached him. Those men had a warrant for Glenn's arrest. He was wanted for capital murder in Mississippi. Glenn stayed in the city jail in Texas for some time before being extradited back to Mississippi and booked into the Pike County Jail. He was held without bail and appointed a public defender. On Saturday, May 21st, 1994, Glenn invited Taronda and her children on a picnic. Taronda's 2 sons, her nephew, and Whitney, along with Glenn's cousin, all went. It was assumed by Taronda that they were going to a park in Hammond, Louisiana, where they all stayed. But after they passed the last Hammond exit, Glenn told them they were going to Percy Quinn State Park in Pike County, Mississippi. Once at the park, Glenn suggested that they rent paddle boats. Now, Taronda couldn't swim and didn't really want to go, but ultimately agreed. Glenn said it would be fun. Strapped with their life jackets, the group of 8 set off in 2 different boats. Glenn paddling one boat with Taronda, Whitney, and one of Taronda's sons. His cousin driving the second boat with the other children. Glenn traveled outside the roped-off paddle boat area. Taronda complained to Glenn that they were going too far from the shore, but Glenn did not turn the boat around. Glenn had paddled almost 3,000 feet from shore and stopped. He then pushed Taronda, knocking Taronda's son from her lap into the water. Taronda went to pull her son back into the boat, but realized Whitney was missing. Taronda then saw Whitney floating on her back with her head above the water with her life jacket on about 20 or 30 feet from the boat. At this time, Whitney was saying, "Daddy, please help me. Daddy, please help me." Glenn jumped into the water to save his daughter. Taronda on the stand said she saw Glenn take Whitney into his arms, go underwater, and pull Whitney down with him. After a few minutes, Glenn surfaced with Whitney's life jacket in his hands. He claimed that he could not find Whitney, but found the life jacket on the floor of the lake. Some nearby fishermen saw the commotion at the paddle boat and went over to help. One fisherman searched for Whitney for an hour and a half. All of the witnesses that testified said they never saw Glenn in the water making any effort to find Whitney. Glenn returned to the shore in the boat that was owned by a man named Craig, a fisherman, who testified that Glenn told him the missing child was not his, but rather the child of a friend. Whitney's body was recovered from the lake on May 23, 1994. The indictment against Glenn charged him with the murder of Whitney while engaged in the commission of the crime of kidnapping on count 1 and kidnapping of Taronda on count 2. Whitney Berry was born October 28, 1990. At some point, Glenn denied paternity of Whitney, and the relationship between Glenn, Taronda, and she was described as sporadic. It was said that Glenn did not purchase diapers, milk, or clothing for Whitney. He was not paying any child support either. In early April 1994, Glenn was reportedly fired from his job at Baton Rouge Home Health. Shortly afterwards, he had inquired about life insurance policies on both Taronda and Whitney. He told the State Farm agent in Hammond that the Louisiana Department of Human Services was requiring that he purchase insurance on one of his children. This was never proven to be true. That same month, he tried purchasing the policy on both Taronda and Whitney unsuccessfully. He was told that they would need to be present to complete the application. After not seeing Taronda for over a year, he popped up on her and was able to convince her to accompany him back to the State Farm office to sign the paperwork. Ultimately, he purchased 2 separate policies worth $100,000 with an accidental death provision. If Taronda and Whitney were to die coincidentally in an accident, Glenn would receive $400,000 in life insurance proceeds. The next day, the day after Whitney drowned, he called State Farm to begin the process of collecting the benefits of the life insurance policy he purchased just a few weeks prior. He continued to call weekly to figure out when the money would be paid out. The calls continued for the next couple of years, all while he was dodging Pike County sheriffs to provide them with a statement. In 1996, State Farm notified Glenn's attorney that the funds would be interpleaded into the court and a trial would be held on the issue of Glenn's paternity of Whitney. Glenn then offered to settle his claim for less than 50 cents on the dollar. After the jury returned their guilty verdict, the sentencing phase began. The jury was excused to discuss Glenn's right to testify, and court was recessed for a while so Glenn could discuss the issue with his attorneys. When he was brought back into the courtroom, Glenn attacked the prosecutor and chaos began. Once things were finally settled and additional evidence was presented to the jury, they were unable to reach a verdict as to sentencing. Therefore, the court sentenced Glenn to life without parole. Glenn and his team of supporters have consistently spoken out about the evidence presented at his trial. Over the years, Glenn has been vocal about his case, and there are numerous articles online that advocate for his innocence. Here are a few that I found to be interesting. Chief Medical Examiner Dr. Stephen Hain filed his autopsy report in May 1994, concluding that Whitney died from accidental fresh water drowning. 4 years later, he recanted, testifying at Glenn's trial that he could not have known whether the drowning was accidental or not, but that he had ruled it accidental so the body could be released in a timely manner. This same pathologist was later cited by the Innocence Project for lacking board certification and for his habit of giving false testimony in order to help the state obtain convictions. The state argued Glenn's motive for murder was to collect on the State Farm life insurance policy. He did intend to purchase a policy when he walked into the State Farm insurance agency, but he intended to purchase a policy that would mature into a college fund for the child he believed to be his daughter. At trial, Taronda admitted that she had lied to Glenn about Whitney's paternity. Another man, Brian Wilson, was Whitney's father. He was actually incarcerated at that time for non-payment of court-ordered child support for Whitney. Also, Glenn was familiar with the insurance agent in charge of that State Farm Hammond office, and in fact, they attended the same church. It was she who persuaded Glenn to buy the type of policy that he bought, explained that it would be better to purchase a life insurance policy, then convert it into a college fund once Whitney reached a certain age. Glenn trusted her advice. The agent persuaded Glenn to purchase 2 more policies at the same time, one insuring him, the other insuring Taronda, and both naming his daughter, Whitney, as beneficiary. But the insurance policy on Whitney was never issued. Coverage was denied due to her history of seizures. Glenn was advised of this by mail prior to the accident. As far as he knew, there was no existing policy on Whitney at the time of her death. Whitney's mother testified for the state. During both cross-examination and on redirect, she admitted that she lied in statements she had given to both the police and State Farm about Whitney's death. She said she did so to cover up for Glenn because she cared for him and did not want him to get into trouble. At that point, the defense counsel insisted that she be read her Miranda rights and appointed an attorney. Taronda then asserted her Fifth Amendment rights in response to all further questions. And family members of Taronda stood with Glenn. They too maintained his innocence. They said Taronda suddenly changed her story. One family member said she was not mentally strong enough to be able to handle the pressure put on her by the prosecution, further saying that she was scared and probably thought she would go to jail if she didn't say what they wanted her to say. I don't know if Glenn is innocent or not, and I don't know why being honest is so hard for some people, but what I do know is a 3-year-old little girl who had her whole life ahead of her lost her life. And either way it goes, it's a tragedy. I pray her mother and all of those involved, especially her siblings as well, have found some type of closure in peace, and may Whitney Berry rest in peace forever. 3. George Bell is spending the rest of his life as a resident of Mississippi's Department of Corrections after pleading guilty to capital murder in 2008, the year after he went on a violent rampage fueled by cocaine. The lifeless body of his girlfriend, Mary Heather Spencer, was found inside his mother's home on Trawick Drive in Jackson in September 2007. That same year, he beat her so bad she required 57 staples in her head. George fled to Oklahoma for 3 months afterwards. Heather dropped those charges against him. Just days after returning to Jackson, George again attacked Heather, this time violently, sexually assaulting her and beating her to death with a flashlight. Blood was everywhere. Robbie Bell, George's mother, entered the bloody scene around 8 p.m. that evening while Heather lay dying on her floor in her own blood, where she would remain until authorities located her body the following day. George left his mother's home about 7:30 a.m. the following morning and went to Heather's house. George's mother made no attempt to contact the police, even though she was sitting in a blood-soaked home with a dead body, and who knows, Heather may could have been saved. George entered Heather's apartment, did a line of cocaine before pulling a gun out on Heather's roommate requesting oral sex, which she refused. He then forced her at gunpoint to the car and took her back to his mother's house. The roommate refused to get out the car when they arrived until she saw Robbie. At some point, Robbie called her brother-in-law, an attorney, and asked him to come over ASAP. He arrived to find all three parties in the backyard. Robbie wanted him to speak to her son, and they both tried getting him to turn himself in. George refused. When he went back inside the home, his uncle grabbed the kidnapped victim and left. Robbie said she was not leaving her son. After leaving, the uncle and the victim saw a police officer, which they flagged down to inform them of the horror they would find on Trawick Drive. The officer called for backup. At that time, Robbie had phoned her brother-in-law to tell him that she and George had left the house for cigarettes and something to drink. The officer was listening to the conversation. They drove to the BP. Robbie got out the vehicle, but George refused. He sat in the car for nearly 4 hours, holding a gun to his throat and neck, threatening suicide. He finally surrendered peacefully and was indicted for capital murder and kidnapping. George pled guilty to both charges and, as mentioned, was sentenced to life in prison without parole. A Hinds County grand jury indicted Robbie Bell for accessory after the fact, but the prosecution was dropped shortly before the trial was scheduled to take place. Robbie had refused to provide detectives with a statement the day of George's arrest and spoke through her attorneys throughout the investigation. I would have certainly liked to hear what her night was like leading up to that chaotic next day. Why she never called the police? Did she know Heather was in there? Like, what if that was your daughter? I just think she got off a little too easy, even though she might just have been a mother trying to help her son in the best way that she could. The way that they're describing how much blood was in this house, ain't no way. With that being said, may Mary Heather Spencer continue to rest in peace. I send condolences to her family.